Facebook. I'm Callie Schweitzer, Managing Editor here at Thrive Global. I'm so thrilled to be joined by renowned psychologist, Harvard Medical School faculty member, Susan David, and the author of Emotional Agility. We have some very exciting news, which is that Susan is going to be giving away 3 books. So please respond in the comments and tell us what you are doing to be more emotionally agile and thrive in 2017. Sue, so happy to have you here.
Thank you for inviting me.
Of course.
Been fun.
Absolutely. Tell us more. Tell us what first does emotional agility mean?
Absolutely. So the key question that I've been concerned about in my work is, what does it take internally in the way we deal with our thoughts, our emotions, and the stories that we tell ourselves every day? Am I good enough? Am I loved? Am I cut out for a particular job? That ultimately enable us to thrive effectively. What I know and what so many people experience is that how we deal with ourselves drives everything. It drives our careers, it drives our relationships, and literally every facet of how we love, live, parent, and lead. So emotional agility is the ability to be able to be with yourself, your thoughts, your difficult emotions, sadness, fear, anger, and so on, in a way that is curious and compassionate, but in which you don't allow yourself to be derailed by those. Instead, bringing yourself with your values, with your intentions, and how you want to be in the world to your everyday living and loving.
And I want to know more about how exactly to do that. But first I want to ask you, how did you get interested in this and in studying emotions?
So that's a long question or a long answer that really dates back to my childhood. Excuse me. I grew up in apartheid South Africa. And while I was a white South African, and then therefore not subject to the same chaos and cruelty as so many of my fellow South Africans, it was nonetheless a time of great chaos and great complexity. So when I was growing up in South Africa as a white South African, you couldn't, as a sentient feeling individual, be unaware of the pain and chaos that so many people were experiencing. And just to give you a very, very frightening statistic, for the average female growing up in South Africa, your chance of being raped was higher than your chance of learning how to read and write. So from a very early age, I became interested in this question: what does it take to thrive in a world that is often chaotic, can be unfair, complex, and where even today we are going through unprecedented global, technological, geopolitical changes. So what does it take to thrive? And then when I was 16 years old, my father was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And he was given months to live. And I had such an interesting experience because on the one hand, people were saying to me, just be positive. Just think happy thoughts, everything's going to be okay. But it wasn't okay. My father, this person who I loved more than anything, was dying and then dead. And somehow this idea that we have in society of just be positive, just be happy, really doesn't cut it in the real world. Life's beauty is inseparable from its fragility, and only if we can navigate the reality of life as it is, not as we want it to be, can we actually thrive. So I had that experience on the one hand, and then on the other had this remarkable teacher. And instead of saying to me, just ignore it in effect, or just be positive, just think positive, this woman showed up to me. She invited me and the rest of the class to keep journals. And so began this extraordinary, secret, silent correspondence with this remarkable woman, where every day I would write about my regrets, my pain, the suffering that my family was going through, and she would come back with these questions. How are you doing? how are things feeling? What's most difficult for you about this? And that interaction actually became the catalyst of my entire career. I realized afterwards that it was moving into a space in which I could show up to myself with compassion but honesty that ultimately helped me to be resilient. And that sparked my research, it sparked my Ph.D. in emotions, my postdoc in emotions, my work as a psychologist, and the book Emotional Agility.
So it's incredibly powerful, and everyone should read the book because it's amazing. Tell us how to take a step back and be able to have that conversation with ourselves. You know, one of the things you talk about in the book is getting hooked.
Yeah.
Tell us what that means, how we can experience that, and how we can stop it.
Absolutely. So all of us have ways that we want to be in the world. We want to be a present and connected parent. We want to be effective with our loved ones. We want to be an inclusive leader. And yet what so often happens in our day-to-day life is we get hooked by our thoughts, our emotions, and our stories. So, for example, I'm being undermined in this meeting, I'm just going to shut up. Or I'm so stressed when I get home from work that I'm going to take my phone to the table and not spend these precious minutes that I have with my child and my family. So being hooked is where you allow your thoughts, I'm not good enough, I'm being undermined, I'd love to take a leap in my career, but I'm just not going to. Our emotions, fears, anger, anxiety, and the stories that we tell ourselves, when we let those drive our behavior, we are hooked. Mm-hmm. And that's the opposite of being emotionally agile. That's being emotionally inagile.
Mm-hmm. And there's a 4-step process for coming out of this, correct?
Yeah. So what I talk about in emotional agility is these core fundamentals of how we can develop greater levels of emotional agility in our lives. And one of the most remarkable capsule ideas around emotional agility, I think, is the one by Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl, who survived the Nazi death camps, wrote, between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is our power to choose. And it's in that choice that comes our growth and freedom. When we are hooked, there's no space between stimulus and response. I'm feeling angry, so I'm going to leave the room. They're starting in on the finances, I'm going to shut down. What emotional agility is, and the processes that I talk about, is enabling us to create that space between stimulus and response so that we can take intentional action. So what does this mean? First, and a really fundamental aspect of emotional agility is to do the opposite of what society tells us. Society tells us to think positive and to be happy. And what that can mean is that we can often move into a space with ourselves where we fundamentally invalidate ourselves. Okay? I'm upset in my job, but I shouldn't be. At least I've got a job. Or I know I'm really upset about this relationship, but I'm just going to think positive. And so what we often start to do, and what the research shows, is that we move into a space with ourselves where we either bottle our emotions, we push them aside, we rationalize, or we brood over and over and over thinking about our emotions. And so a first part of emotional agility that is critical is what I call showing up. The idea that you can be with your emotions in a way that notices them, that is compassionate towards them, and that recognizes that our emotions contain very important signals about things that we actually care about, and we can talk about that later. So our emotions are data, not directions, but they're data that are worth noticing and feeling and recognizing. So a first part of emotional agility is the ability to be willing and able and compassionate around your emotional experience. I then talk in the book about how you can create really effective distance between you and your emotions. You know, who's in charge? the thinker or the thought? Who's in charge, my emotion, or me, the person who is big enough to experience all of my emotions? Who's in charge, my Facebook feed or Donald Trump's Twitter feed, or me, the person who gets to choose intentionally what I do with my time? And so in the second part of emotional agility, or the second process, I talk about how we create this really important space, then how we can move into walking our why, recognizing that who we are, what our values are, and what we stand for is the most important way that we can bring ourselves to the world. And then I talk in very, very practical, and the whole book is practical, about steps that we can take to cultivate changes in our habits, in our mindset, and in our motivations, so that we live in ways that are more congruent. And just by the way, you'd mentioned emotional agility, and you'd mentioned that people should read it, but one of the things for people who are listening right now, and I know you'd mentioned this at the beginning, is that we're doing a 3-book giveaway. So if you're watching now, please enter in the answer to this question: what are you doing in 2017 to help you to thrive?
Love this. So one of the things we are all about at Thrive Global is Microsteps. And I know that's something that's very dear to your heart as well. So tell me, if I'm going to take one small step today toward becoming more emotionally agile, what can I do?
So absolutely, a core part of effective change is the idea that tiny tweaks or micro steps make a real difference. So we don't need to sell up and move to France in order to change our lives. We can make real changes in our everyday. So, for example, I'll give you one example, but there are many. Imagine there is a change that you want to make in your life. It might be you want to be more present with your children, or you want to be a more inclusive leader. We know that if you cultivate small habits around that, a small micro step or a small tiny tweak, it makes a real difference. So one of the things that I talk about in emotional agility, for example, is the psychology of habit change. That there's this idea called piggybacking. So imagine you've already got a habit. You want to be a present parent, and you've already got a habit, and that is when you come home from work, you put your keys in a particular drawer. And you've recognized that you've stopped being present with your children, that you're more focused on your phone than you are with them. So what you might do is you might take a pre-existing habit and piggyback a new values-based action onto that habit. So you put your keys in the drawer, and now you put your cell phone in the drawer as well. Or you're trying to increase your fruit intake. You already have a cup of coffee every morning, so you add just one piece of fruit to that. These are tiny values-aligned tweaks that we know have a multiplier effect. What they do is they are more sustainable because they're values-aligned rather than being a change that we're doing because everyone else tells us. But they are more likely to be sustained if they're small and values connected when we're under stress, when we're under pressure. So that's one example that is really just a small but critical example of a tiny tweak.
So my last question before I turn it over to you for any final thoughts is, one of the things I think is so interesting is this idea that bad moods are not bad things. Can you talk to us a little bit about sort of how to come to terms with that in your own mind when we have been told as a society that be positive, be happy?
So absolutely. So just to be clear, I'm not anti-happiness. I've actually written an 80-chapter end-to-end handbook of what do we know about human happiness. But what's really interesting is that people who strive to be happier, they set goals and expectations around happiness, actually over time tend to become less happy. So there's a large body of research that is accruing around this setting happiness as a goal actually undermines happiness. And there are a couple of reasons for this, but what it denies is our essential humanity. Charles Darwin wrote a lesser known book than the origin of the species, called The Expression of Emotion in Man and Animals. And what he wrote in this book is how our emotions are critical to our survival. They help us to recognize who to trust and who not to trust. They help us to calibrate our actions. And when we are feeling angry or feeling fearful, what we often don't recognize is that those emotions contain signposts to the things we most value. I've never met a guilty parent who at some level isn't concerned about how do I be present, or someone whose idea was stolen at work who isn't at some level concerned about issues of equity and fairness. So beneath our emotions are often signposts to the things that we really care about. And when we push those emotions aside in the service of being happy or having a positive attitude or thinking positive, what we are not doing is effectively mining those emotions and also developing resilience with those emotions. So one of the things that I talk about in the book is this idea that if we think about fear, for example, people will say, do away with the fear, conquer fear, get rid of fear. But fear is a normal human emotion. So how can we be compassionate to our fear, learn from our fear, and still choose to take action in the service of our values? Courage is not an absence of fear. Courage is fear walking. Courage is about noticing your fear and choosing to move in a particular direction.
Love that. Amazing note to end on.
Thank
I want to make
you.
sure you have a chance to say anything.
Yeah, so thank you. So two things. The first is that I've developed a quiz that so far 40,000 people have actually taken. So if this is of interest to your listeners, it's susandavid.com/learn, and it's a quick 5-minute quiz that then gives people a 10-page report along the lines of their emotional agility. I've also, for people who are interested in these skills in children, I talk about it in the book, but I've also got a New York Times article that I was interviewed for that speaks to this. So just very lastly, people often say to me, what can I do today to help me to be more emotionally agile? And I would ask a couple of questions. The first is, are there parts of your life where you've become so focused on being right? It might be in politics, it might be in your interactions with your family, it might be about your leadership, where you've become so focused on being right that you've actually forgotten to be effective. You know, we become so focused on being right, on us and them, that we forget how to navigate the world in an effective way. A second question is, are there things in your life that you are holding onto that may be causing you resentment or causing you frustration that you actually need to just let go of? And that's an act of choice. And then last is, are there parts of your life where you've become so focused on comfort? Because human beings are drawn to what makes us comfortable. We derive comfort in our relationships. We can predict what our partner's going to say after a movie or what they're going to order over dinner. Are there times where you've become so focused on comfort that you've given way to your own growth? And where it's important to recognize that courage is not the absence of fear, courage is fear walking.
Love that. Thank you so much.
Thank
Sue
you.
David, renowned
Thank you.
psychologist, author of Emotional Agility. Thanks so much, Facebook.